This is an ABC News special report.
We have breaking news to report coming out of Afghanistan at this hour. The details are still a bit sketchy, but here's what we know confirmed from the Pentagon at this hour. We can confirm an explosion outside Kabul airport. Casualties are unclear at this time. We will provide additional details when we can. We are, of course, waiting on those additional details. But, of course, this comes at a time where the U.S. had warned of possible terror attacks, possible suicide bombings there in Kabul. They had been urging Americans and other Afghans who were trying to get to the airport to be airlifted out of that city to not come to the airport under these threats. They said unless you had been directed to specifically to please stay where you are, as they work towards getting as many Americans and Afghans out of that country by that August 31st deadline. We're going to turn to Ian Pannell, who has been reporting from Kabul for the past several weeks. He has just made his way to Qatar, but just hours ago he was there right outside the airport and saw for himself the desperate people trying to get out of that country and the situation that was unfolding. And so, Ian, you can give us a sense of what it's like there in Kabul right now. And, of course, amid these reports of an explosion, it can't even be, it's hard to imagine what the chaos must be like there right now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, it seems as though all the warnings, all the fears have come to pass. I mean, the British government in particular was very explicit, saying it was very, very credible and imminent warning of a potential ISIS-K attack. ISIS-K is ISIS Khorasan. It's the Afghanistan branch of ISIS. They don't have a huge presence in the country, but they certainly have a brutal presence in the country. They are the ones that carried out bomb attacks before on schools, high numbers of civilian casualties. We don't know very many details at the moment. The little we know is there's been confirmation from Pentagon spokesman John Kirby that there has been an attack. One of our colleagues from another network, Pakistani network, who's in Afghanistan at the moment, says that he had heard from eyewitnesses that it appears there was potentially a suicide attack. Again, the details are very fluid. There been some kind of gunfire as well at the incident. We saw within the last 24 hours the sheer numbers of people down there, thousands and thousands of people clustered. That's why the U.S. Embassy issued this very specific warning to all U.S. citizens to leave the gate, quote, immediately, to go back home because of this threat. Other European nations, other NATO nations also followed suit, telling all of their citizens to leave the gate and await word. It seems that the worst fears have come true. No details on casualties at this moment, but this clearly imperils the continuing mission to try and get people out of the country. As I say, we've got a number of questions out to people out on the ground as to the specifics of exactly what happened. But just to reiterate, we're hearing an IED explosion, potentially a suicide attack at one of the gates, potentially Abbey Gate, which is where we were, that very crowded area of the city where thousands of people were clustered, waving their papers, waving their passports, trying to get through. If that's happened, it really jeopardizes the ongoing mission to try and evacuate people from Afghanistan.
And Ian, we know you were there just a few hours ago. We saw your incredible reporting as you saw those thousands of people pushing against the gate despite the warnings. We're hearing from U.S. officials, Western officials urging people to leave, but that was not the case. Did you see any fewer people there than you had in days past? In fact, had the numbers increased, obviously concerning what happened there with an explosion, it's hard to imagine just what the casualties may be given the scene you were at. If you can just give us a sense of what it felt like, how many people were there, and was there any sense that anybody was heeding those warnings?
Yeah, I mean, what you have to understand, a couple of things is there are a number of gates and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people gathered around there. Now, I think over the last week, those numbers have slimmed down, partly because some people have got through, other people have given up, but also because the Taliban have stopped allowing Afghan nationals from getting through to that point. But within the last 24 hours, it was thousands of people there, and they were all crushed together. Some were wading knee-deep in sewage water. There was no sense of space there. You know, people are desperate. People are clustering at the gate. The other key thing here is, you know, the U.S. Embassy can issue warnings, but it's not like you or I. People aren't staring at their phones. They're not getting those messages through necessarily unless you get an individual message to your phone, a phone call, which, of course, some people have had. Then people aren't necessarily going to hear those warnings. I think more importantly, people won't heed them, such as the desperation on the ground, such as the clamor to try and escape the country. People hear warnings all the time. They know the risk living in Afghanistan. They've seen multiple bomb attacks, suicide attacks, targeted gunfire, ambushes over the years. But that is how desperate people are, is that even though those warnings are out there, that they still cluster in those numbers around the gates. And, I can't begin to describe really quite how many people were there, quite how closely they were packed together in that relatively small area by each gate. It's not just one gate, it's multiple gates trying to get out. So any one of those gates, you're talking about significant numbers of people together, tightly packed. If there's some kind of IED or suicide attack, that is likely to inflict mass casualties. But again, we don't have those details at the moment. Only confirmation from John Kirby that this incident took place. As I say, it's very fluid. We're still getting full information through.
Well, we know you will stay on top of all of that for us, Ian. Incredible reporting again there from Qatar now, but in Kabul just a short while ago. Ian, panel, thank you for that. We're going to turn now to our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent, Martha Raddatz. And Martha, we're now hearing that there will be a briefing around 10:30 where we're hopefully going to get some more details. But if you can give us a sense of what you've learned over these past few minutes, we know the details are fluid.
Amy, even overnight, I was sent video from the airport, from Abbey Gate, and there were thousands of people there overnight trying to get in. Many people were turned away. There are stories of them being turned away because of that urgent alert from the U.S. State Department to stay away. This is what's called a threat stream that they've had for days now. They worried about this exact scenario, that a suicide bomber, and that's our initial reporting, that it was a suicide bomber, gets into one of those crowds and causes mass casualties. And this is why last night it was so urgent and so imminent. And we heard the ambassador this morning, the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, say how serious a threat this was and that it was imminent. And they would not have put that alert out if they did not think someone was on their way to do harm. This is truly a nightmare scenario because you have a deadline of American forces getting out of there on August 31st, people trying to get out, and now this explosion at one of those gates. It will surely shut down that whole area, and there will be a lot of questions about what the U.S. does next. One of the things President Biden has said again and again is that he is concerned about U.S. troops. He wants them out of there because the danger is increasing. You also have to wonder how, if they had such incredible intelligence on this, how they were not able to somehow try and stop this. That's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to do, but this is exactly the kind of thing they were tracking for several days.
Yes, and despite, yes, we heard those warnings urging Americans and Afghans not to come to the gates unless they had been specifically ordered to do so because of this threat that they obviously deemed credible. We also heard from Secretary of State Blinken saying there was really no deadline, that August 31st deadline, to get those 1,500 Americans who we believe are still there in the country. But obviously, what does this do to that operation, Martha, to have a terror attack like this, the worst case scenario happen, what Americans were concerned about, what they were warning about, but to actually have it happen, what does it do to the process that already was going to be a difficult task over the next few days?
It really devastates that process. And again, that panic that was already there. I mean, seeing the scenes from last night, hearing flashbang grenades go off to try to break up the crowds, to try to warn them to get away. There is absolute panic in Afghanistan for people trying to get out. Secretary Blinken says, yes, we will keep trying to get people out, but he has not given any sort of plan on how that will happen. How will you get these vulnerable Afghans out? And now, today, they're facing either a stampede, the Taliban, or ISIS bombers. And that really is what it comes down to for all Afghans, and especially those vulnerable Afghans and American citizens. And those American citizens are not all out of there. One of the documents I got last night was passports of 2 young children, an American mom, unable to get out.
Wow. All right, Martha Raddatz, we know you're staying on top of this for us as we continue to get more information. We're going to turn to Willie Martinez, our Pentagon producer, who does have some more information about where this explosion specifically took place. Willie.
Hey, Amy, we are hearing from a U.S. official that who confirms to ABC News that the explosion did occur at Abbey Gate. That is the location that Ian Pannell was just talking about a moment ago. This U.S. official says that they are currently assessing casualty numbers right now, that the situation remains very, very fluid on the ground as they try to respond, and that it may be that the situation itself may be ongoing. But for now, we do have confirmation that this was at the Abbey Gate, which is one of the main entrances to the airport, where thousands of people have been gathered. And on the other side, you have Western forces, mostly American troops, standing guard there, sorting individuals as they come by. As we've heard from Ian and from Martha, big threat that emerged last night about the possibility that ISIS, Khorasan, and an ISIS offshoot might be planning some kind of an attack targeting civilians. And so that's why the messages were sent to American citizens not to go to any of the gates or the approaches to the airport, but confirmation now that this was at the Abbey Gate.
And Louis, this may be one of the worst case scenarios because, as we heard Ian reporting and you just reiterated there, thousands of people at last count were there despite those warnings from Western officials to please stay where you are, to not come to the airport. This potentially is one of those worst case scenarios, correct?
It is, because we've seen the numbers of people who have gathered there on the other side of the fence, if you will, and those gates. Desperate people holding up documents, trying to get past the Western security forces that are there. But it's what is called a soft target. The terrorists will try to attack at locations where security is not as tight as it could be. We know that there will be tight security on the American side of the fence. We know that there will be tight security at the Taliban checkpoints. But when you have large numbers of people gathered at one location, that is a soft target, because somebody could filter in and set off a suicide vest. Somebody potentially could drive a car bomb vehicle in there as well. So a lot of this makes for a very enticing target for a terrorist who wants to create a big impact. And this is the kind of situation that we're now seeing happen.
All right, Louis Martinez, our Pentagon producer there with the very latest on that. And again, we are getting confirmation now from the Pentagon that this explosion in Kabul happened at Abbey Gate, where we know thousands of people have gathered over the last several days, desperately trying to get out of Afghanistan. We have Colonel Stephen Ganyard standing by, a former State Department official, with some more perspective on what may be happening there on the ground. Colonel Ganyard, thank you for being with us. And just give us your best sense of what's happening right now as we're all trying to assess what the damage is, how many people, how many casualties may be involved right now in this situation.
Amy, I think what's going on from the U.S. perspective at this point is to figure out whether there are any U.S. or NATO troops involved. We know that the Turks have been responsible for the perimeter security of the airport in Kabul, although they announced yesterday that they were pulling out and probably would leave before the U.S. does. So still unknown whether the U.S. troops had to pick up responsibility for the entry point near that gate. And I'm sure that's what's going on right now to make sure that there are no U.S. casualties. But to Louis' point, it just sort of depends on what the intent of the suicide bombing was. If they wanted to take out a lot of civilians, they probably would have detonated within a large group of civilians outside the gate. Or if they were looking to embarrass NATO or the U.S., they would have tried to have gotten as close to the troops who were manning the actual gate itself. The other consideration here is that when the Taliban came in and they liberated the prisons, many of the ISIS-K prisoners that the U.S. and the Afghans had put in those prisons were allowed to escape. And so all of a sudden there was a terrorist threat that might not have been so strong after the Taliban emptied the prison. So this has been the concern that some former prisoners or former ISIS-K folks may have been the impetus for these suicide bombings. But we still think that the Taliban have their vested interest will be in allowing a clean escape and allowing the U.S. to get as many people out by the 31st. They need money. They need support from the international community. And something like this is certainly not going to help the Taliban. So the only positive that I could see coming out of this is the Taliban may try to track down and recapture some ISIS-K folks so that they can prevent another one of these suicide bombings.
Well, Colonel Ganyard, we appreciate your expertise and insight into what's going on right now there on the ground in Kabul. We're going to turn back again to Martha Raddatz. Martha, you were talking about a video earlier, and we have that now for the viewers. If you can describe what it is, what you see, what you hear.
I want to first say what you're seeing right now is the live shot from Kabul. It's probably about 6:30 there, and that is our night video. That's the last video we have from Abbey Gate. This was many hours ago. It was in the middle of the night. But what you hear are those surging crowds going up to Abbey Gate. I'm going to let you hear that. And right there, they were throwing flashbangs to disperse that crowd. This was taken by Jericho Denman. He is a veteran who has been filling us in on what has happened inside. Again, this is not right now, this is last night, but it gives you a sense of Abbey Gate and what was happening there overnight. And you can hear those crowds. And we do have reports from today that there was also a gunfight after what initial reporting is that there was some kind of suicide bombing. That could have been a gunfight. It could have been troops firing on people who were assisting that bomber or whatever else they could find out at the scene. I do know that I believe the U.S. and Taliban have actually tried to cooperate on going after ISIS because of this threat. But again, it appears to have failed, that they were not able to stop this kind of attack. And there reverberations from this will go on for weeks and weeks, Amy.
Oh, yeah. As you know, it will affect all of the continuing evacuation efforts that are underway right now. And it is interesting because you talk about perhaps even collaboration between the Taliban and U.S. forces there on the ground trying to stop ISIS. But we had these warnings. They were credible, clearly. And the U.S. and the Western officials, you could tell, were certainly taking them seriously by urging people not to come to those gates. I have to say, listening to that video, as much as seeing it from overnight, Martha, is pretty stunning because you can hear the desperation. You can hear the chaos and just people wanting and clearly risking their lives to try and get out of that country. What is the sense that the Taliban has any control or order going on around those gates, trying to prevent people from exactly what happens, being there in large groups, knowing that that's a soft target, a huge target for any potential terror attack?
It sure is, and it is tragic that this happened. What's going to happen now if, and I presume they still will leave on August 31st, the Taliban will take over those gates. Jericho from inside there was telling me during the week that the Taliban were very close to those gates anyway, very close, 50 yards away from U.S. forces trying to guard those gates. But the Taliban will take over security. They will take over the airport. And that is why there is such panic, especially against of these Afghan allies, because those people who want to leave, and the Taliban has said, you can't leave, we don't want you to leave, these Afghan allies, they have to try to get out, and they have to try to get through the Taliban. Amy?
All right, Martha Raddatz, thank you for that. And again, just to remind our viewers, we are monitoring the situation in Kabul, Afghanistan, where an explosion took place just outside of the airport there. We know what happened at Abbey Gate, and it is a gate we have been watching for the past several days because thousands of people have been there desperately trying to get out of that country. We are continuing to gather information just to the extent of the casualties of the situation and what it may do to the further evacuation process going on there in Kabul. We're going to return you to regular programming, which for some of you will be Good Morning America. But of course, you can continue to watch our coverage online on our streaming channel, and we will come back in to provide any updates as they are warranted. Thanks for watching.
This has been a special report from ABC News.